Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about a colour. Specifically, we're going to talk about green, the most beautiful green you've ever seen. Vivid, electric, impossible to look away from, the kind of green that makes every other green look dull and provisional. The kind of green that stopped people in the street in the 1860s and made them stare, that filled ballrooms with a shimmer that candlelight made even more extraordinary, that appeared on ball gowns and artificial flowers and wallpaper and children's toys and Christmas decorations and the covers of books and the painted surfaces of 1,000 ordinary objects in 1,000 ordinary Victorian homes. The kind of green that was killing people. Not slowly, not in ways that were easy to ignore, not in ways that could be explained away as coincidence or bad luck or the general misfortune of living in the 19th century, which offered plenty of opportunities to die from things that weren't your wallpaper. Before we get into it, take a moment to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps, and there's a lot more of this coming. Alright, let's begin. The year is 1862. You are in London. The dress you are wearing tonight took your dressmaker 3 weeks to complete. It is silk, a warm ivory at its base, but the silk is overlaid and trimmed with something else. A gauze, very fine, very light, that catches the light differently from the silk beneath it. The gauze is green, not the muddy olive or the blue-grey sage that earlier dyes produced. It is green the way a tropical bird is green, saturated, pure, almost unnaturally vivid. Standing in your bedroom before you leave, you turn in front of the mirror and the gauze moves with you, and the green shifts and shimmers in the candlelight in a way that is genuinely beautiful. That is the entire reason you chose this fabric. That is the reason your dressmaker's shop has been overwhelmed with orders for this particular colour for the past several years. Around the neckline, your dressmaker has trimmed the dress with artificial flowers. Small ones, roses mostly, and a few sprigs of something leafy. They are made of fabric over wire frames, hand-tinted in a green that matches the gauze almost exactly, and they have been applied to the dress with such care that they look, at a ballroom's distance, like something that might actually have grown there. You have done your hair with a few of the same artificial flowers, tucked into the arrangement that your maid spent an hour constructing. There are more on the fan you're carrying. Real flowers this time, silk ones trimmed in the same green. You look, you think, examining yourself in the mirror one last time before going down. Extraordinary. You are also, though you don't know it, being poisoned. Not in a dramatic, acute way. Not in the way that will be obvious tonight. Not in the way that will produce the kind of symptoms that send someone to bed immediately. In a slow, cumulative way. The kind of way that is easy, for months, to attribute to other things. To fatigue, to the demands of the social season, to the general state of health that is always somewhat uncertain in a city that hasn't yet figured out all of its sanitation problems. The kind of way that is easy to explain away until sometimes it isn't. The green that you are wearing is dyed with something called Scheele's green, or one of its successors, copper arsenite, or Paris green, which is copper ashitoarstenite, and it contains arsenic, a great deal of arsenic. The arsenic that gives the colour its extraordinary vibrancy is the same arsenic that, absorbed through the skin over hours of wear, through the lungs as particles of dye shed from the fabric into the air around you, through the hands when you touch the flowers and then touch your face, is entering your body tonight and will continue entering it every time you wear this dress. You will wear it many times. It is your best dress. To understand how this happened, how a known poison ended up in half the fabric in Victorian England, in the wallpaper of Victorian nurseries, in children's toys and book covers, and the decorative wax on Christmas trees, and hundreds of other ordinary objects. You have to understand where the colour came from, and why it was so impossible, once it existed, to simply stop. The story begins in 1775, when a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele synthesized what became known as Scheele's green, a compound of copper and arsenic, copper arsenite, that produced a green of extraordinary brightness. Scheele himself noted in his own papers that the compound was toxic. He was a chemist. He knew what arsenic was. He noted the toxicity and published the synthesis, and the colour went into use anyway, because the colour was beautiful, and the Victorian world, like any world, wanted beautiful things. By the early 19th century, Scheele's green had been improved upon by a German manufacturer named Wilhelm Dye, who produced an even more stable, more vivid green compound, copper actorstenite, which became known as Paris green, or emerald green, or Vienna green, depending on where you bought it. The Paris green was brighter than Scheele's green. It was more stable, less likely to fade when washed or exposed to light. It was the most beautiful artificial green that human chemistry had ever produced, and it was everywhere. The fabric trade adopted it immediately. Green fabric had always been a challenge. Earlier green dyes made from plant sources were inconsistent, prone to fading, difficult to achieve at the saturated, vivid level that fashion demanded. Scheele's green and Paris green solved all of these problems at once. They produced exactly the color that the eye wanted, reliably and reproducibly, at a price that the market could absorb. The wallpaper industry adopted it. William Morris, yes, that William Morris, the designer whose work is still used in fabric and wallpaper today, whose romanticized vision of pre-industrial craft is one of the defining aesthetic presences of the Victorian era. William Morris's family firm was a significant producer of arsenic-pigmented wallpaper. The greens in Morris's famous designs, the rich, deep botanical greens that still appear on his wallpapers, were in significant cases achieved with arsenic-based pigments. Morris himself, for years, resisted accepting the connection between his wallpapers and the illnesses they caused. His family owned copper mines that also produced arsenic as a byproduct. The commercial and personal entanglement was complete. The toy industry adopted it. The candy industry, briefly, horrifyingly, adopted it for coloring confections green. The artificial flower trade, which supplied the trimmings for dresses and hats that were worn closest to the face and the hands, was among the heaviest users of the green dyes. And the wallpaper. We will come back to the wallpaper. Let's talk about the workers first. Because the people who died earliest and most dramatically from the Victorian green were not the people wearing the dresses. They were the people making the things that other people wore. The artificial flower trade in Victorian London was a significant industry, employing thousands of workers, most of them women and girls, many of them children working in the East End and other areas where manufacturing labour was concentrated. The work of making artificial flowers involved handling arsenic-dyed fabric and paper continuously for hours each day, 6 days a week, in rooms that were often poorly ventilated and that accumulated dust from the materials being worked. Arsenic can enter the body through the skin, absorption, gradual, continuous exposure. It can enter through the lungs, inhalation of arsenic dust, which is generated whenever arsenic-containing materials are handled, cut, shaped, pressed. It can enter through the mouth, ingestion of dust that settles on food, on hands that touch food, in a workroom where the boundary between workspace and eating space was not maintained with any rigor. The artificial flower workers were absorbing arsenic through all 3 routes simultaneously, day after day, for years. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are not, in their early stages, specific. They do not announce themselves as arsenic poisoning. They announce themselves as the ordinary ailments of a working-class Victorian woman doing heavy labour in poor conditions. Fatigue, headache, nausea, skin irritation, a gradual loss of appetite. These symptoms are easy to attribute to the conditions of life in general, to the cold, to the long hours, to the inadequate food, to the bad air of the city. The connection between the green dye and the symptoms requires noticing that the symptoms are concentrated among the workers handling this specific material, that they improve when the exposure stops, that they follow the pattern of a specific chemical insult rather than a general deterioration of health. A medical officer named John Simon, reporting to the Privy Council in 1863, documented the conditions of the artificial flower workers with a directness that was rare for official Victorian reports on working conditions. He described workers with persistent skin eruptions, the characteristic dermatitis that arsenic exposure produces, the inflammation of the nasal passages, the eye irritation, the sores on the hands that appeared where the skin had been in continuous contact with the green material. He described workers who had been healthy when they started the work and who were ill 6 months later in specific and consistent ways that pointed clearly to an occupational cause. The trade did not stop. The demand for the green flowers was too great. The workers were not in a position to refuse the work. The labour market for women in the East End of London in the 1860s did not offer many alternatives, and the need to eat was more immediate than the long-term risk of cumulative arsenic exposure. The employers were not compelled to change their materials by any regulatory force that had sufficient power to compel them. The Victorian state was deeply reluctant to regulate the conditions of private commercial enterprise, and the regulatory structures that existed were inadequate for the scale and the complexity of what was happening. And the women who wore the flowers had no idea. This is the part that requires the most careful attention, because it is the part where the story becomes genuinely complex, where it stops being simply a story of industrial poisoning and becomes something more entangled, more uncomfortable, more revealing of how systems of harm operate when the harm is distributed, invisible, and profitable. The woman in the green dress at the 1862 ball did not know that her dress was dangerous, not because she was stupid, not because she was incurious, because the information was not available to her in any form that connected the colour she had chosen to any risk she was running. The arsenic in her dress was not on the label. There were no labels, not in the modern sense. The chemistry of the dye was not discussed in the social contexts where fabric was purchased and admired. The workers who were becoming ill were not people in her social world, and their illness was not reported in the publications she read. She was wearing a dress. She had paid a dressmaker to make it. The dressmaker had sourced the fabric from a supplier. The supplier had sourced the dye from a manufacturer. Each link in this chain knew more than the previous one about what was in the green, and at the end of the chain, where the knowledge was most complete, the decision to keep using it was made repeatedly, for years. The manufacturers knew what arsenic was. The dyers knew what arsenic was. The chemists who improved and refined the compounds knew with precision what they were working with and what the health effects of exposure were. This was not obscure medical knowledge, it was basic chemistry. And the knowledge moved along the chain in one direction only. It stayed with the manufacturers, it stayed with the technical specialists, it did not travel to the consumer. This is not a specifically Victorian problem. It is a structural problem. The structure of markets in which the people who benefit from selling a product have the most information about its risks, and the people who bear the risks have the least information about them, and the incentive structure of the market does not naturally correct for this, because correcting for it requires either regulatory compulsion or a level of public knowledge that takes time and effort, and often a considerable body of harm to accumulate. What was needed was exactly what eventually happened. The accumulation of enough public cases of harm, well documented and widely publicized enough, that the connection between the colour and the consequence became impossible to deny. Let's talk about some of those cases, because they are specific, and the specificity is what makes them land. In 1861, a young woman named Matilda Scheurer died in London. She was 19 years old. She had been working as an artificial flower maker for some years, handling green materials daily. In the weeks before her death, she experienced convulsions. Her eyes turned green. She vomited green material. The arsenic that her body had accumulated over years of exposure finally overwhelming its capacity to manage. She died in circumstances that her physicians recorded with the specific note that the cause was arsenic poisoning, traced directly to her occupational exposure. Matilda Scheurer's case was reported in the medical press. It was reported in some general newspapers. The connection was drawn explicitly between the artificial flower trade, the arsenic pigments used, and her death. And the response to her death, the response of the industry, the response of the regulatory bodies, the response of the consumers who were buying the flowers that workers like Matilda were dying to produce, was not swift or decisive. It was not ignored exactly. The case was discussed. The hazard was noted. Some physicians and health reformers used it as evidence in arguments for greater regulation of industrial conditions. But the flowers kept selling. The green dresses kept being made. The wallpaper kept going up. The wallpaper. We have been circling around it, and now we need to go in. Of all the forms in which arsenic-based green pigments entered Victorian homes, the wallpaper was the most pervasive, the most intimate, and the most insidious. Because the wallpaper was always there. The dress you took off at night, the flowers you removed when you came home, the green-covered book you put down when you finished reading, but the wallpaper stayed on the walls. It was in the room where you slept, in the room where the children slept, in the room where you spent your evenings, in every room of the house that had been decorated with green patterns using arsenic-based pigments. And the wallpaper didn't only expose you to arsenic through the direct contact of touching it, it exposed you through the air. Here is the mechanism that took longest to understand, and that, once understood, explained a great deal of the puzzling, gradual, difficult-to-diagnose illness that appeared in households with arsenic wallpaper. The arsenic pigment in the wallpaper, particularly in damp conditions, in rooms where moisture was present, in walls that were imperfectly waterproofed, was converted by specific molds that grew in and behind the wallpaper into a gas. Trimethylarsine, a volatile, highly toxic organic arsenic compound that evaporated from the wallpaper surface into the room air and was inhaled by everyone in the room. The Italians called it the smell of the ghost. Garlic-like, faint, easy to miss entirely, but produced in quantities sufficient to cause the chronic, progressive, diffuse illness that appeared in households with certain patterns of wallpaper and that disappeared or improved significantly when the wallpaper was removed. The person who identified this mechanism most clearly was an Italian chemist named Bartolomeo Gosio, working in the 1890s. But by the time Gosio published his findings, a public campaign against arsenic wallpaper had already been building in Britain for years, driven not by understanding of the exact mechanism, but by the empirical observation made by enough physicians and reformers and worried householders that certain wallpapers were associated with certain illnesses in the houses that contained them. William Morris, as we noted, was resistant to this conclusion for years. His resistance was not simple denial. It was entangled with the commercial interests of his family firm, with his own aesthetic commitment to the designs that used the pigments, and with a genuine philosophical discomfort about being told that the beautiful things he had spent his life making were harming the people who lived with them. He eventually acknowledged the problem, reluctantly, and moved toward less hazardous pigments. By this time, the campaign against arsenic in wallpaper and in household goods generally was well established. The arsenic in the wallpaper was not a case of manufacturers hiding what they knew. It was something more complex, a case of manufacturers who had been slow to understand what they were dealing with. In an era when the science of chronic, low-level exposure to specific toxins was genuinely not well developed, operating in a market where the beauty of the product was evident and the harm was obscure and slow. But it was also, in some cases, a case of manufacturers who did understand and preferred not to investigate too carefully because the investigation might require changes that were expensive and commercially inconvenient. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the combination of them, genuine scientific uncertainty mixed with motivated incuriosity, is one of the most recognizable patterns in the history of industrial harm. The tide turned slowly, and from several directions at once. The medical press was consistently ahead of the general press in documenting the harm, but the general press eventually caught up. By the 1870s, articles about the dangers of arsenic in consumer goods, wallpaper, fabric, artificial flowers, toys, were appearing in newspapers and magazines read by the middle-class consumer audience that was the primary market for these products. The articles were sometimes sensationalist in tone, sometimes careful and specific, but their cumulative effect was to create a public awareness that had simply not existed before. The awareness created market pressure. Manufacturers who could credibly advertise that their products were arsenic-free did so because there was now a market for the reassurance. Guaranteed free from arsenic appeared on wallpaper samples. No arsenic used in our dyes appeared in advertisements for fabric merchants. The creation of this marketing category was itself an acknowledgement that the old products contained what the new products were advertising their absence of. The regulatory response came later and more hesitantly. The British government was reluctant, on general political philosophical grounds, to regulate consumer products with anything like the directness that the scale of harm would have justified. There were parliamentary debates, there were reports commissioned and received and not fully acted upon. There was the general Victorian tension between the evidence of harm and the resistance to state interference in the market, a tension that was resolved more slowly in Britain than the evidence of harm might have seemed to demand. Some of the most effective advocacy came from physicians, and here the story of Victorian medical reform intersects with the arsenic story in ways that are worth noting. The growing professionalisation of medicine across the Victorian period, the development of medical journalism, the increasing willingness of physicians to engage in public advocacy on questions of public health, all of these made the medical profession a more effective voice for action than it would have been a generation earlier. By the 1880s and 1890s, the use of arsenic-based green pigments in consumer goods was declining significantly, driven by the combination of public awareness, market pressure, and the gradual development of safer alternatives. New synthetic dyes, the aniline dyes that had been developing since the 1850s, offered a range of colours that, while not without their own problems, did not contain arsenic. The chemistry of colour was moving forward, and as it moved forward, the specific toxicity of the Victorian greens became less inevitable. The green did not disappear overnight. Things that are beautiful and profitable disappear slowly, even when they are killing people, but it did disappear. The most famous green of the Victorian era, the green that filled ballrooms and drew eyes in the street, that covered the walls of the parlours where the middle class performed its respectability, that trimmed the dresses of young women who had no idea they were being poisoned. That green faded from use over the course of a decade or two, leaving behind wallpaper patterns and fabric samples in museum collections, and a history that is both a warning and a study in how harm operates when it is invisible and profitable. Back to the ballroom, back to 1862. You are dancing, in your green dress, in a room lit by hundreds of candles, with the green gauze catching the light and the artificial flowers nodding at your neckline as you move. You look beautiful. You feel, if you are honest, a slight headache, the kind you've been having more often lately, that you've been attributing to the demands of the season, to the late nights, to perhaps not eating quite as well as you should be. You do not attribute it to the dress. The woman dancing next to you is also wearing green. Several of the women in this room are wearing green, because green is fashionable, because the green that chemistry has produced in the last few decades is more beautiful than any green that existed before it, and fashion follows beauty. Nobody in this room knows what is in the colour. Nobody in this room is making a choice they understand to be dangerous. They are making a choice about beauty, and the beauty is real, and the danger is hidden inside it, and this is the specific cruelty of the situation. Not malice, not stupidity, but the gap between what can be seen and what cannot be seen, between the surface of a thing and its chemistry. The chemistry was always there. The arsenic was always in the dye. The harm was always accumulating in the artificial flower worker's lungs, and the drawing room wallpaper, and the child's toy on the nursery floor. What was missing was not the evidence. The evidence was in the bodies of the people it was harming, and the bodies were real. What was missing was the framework to connect those bodies to this colour, and the will to act on that connection once it was made. Both eventually arrived, not as fast as they should have, not without significant cost in lives and health that should not have been paid. But they arrived. The green went away. The lesson it left behind is not simple, because the lesson is not be careful what colour you choose. The lesson is about the structure of harm, how it concentrates at one end of a supply chain and disperses at the other, how the people most exposed to a risk are often the people with the least ability to understand or avoid it, how beauty and profit together make a powerful argument for not looking too closely at what is underneath. We are not finished learning it. The specific green is gone. The structure that produced it is still entirely legible in the world we live in now, in the supply chains of every industry that produces beautiful things at low cost, in the distribution of risk that puts the harm near the production and the enjoyment near the consumption, in the motivated incuriosity that keeps manufacturers from investigating what they might prefer not to know. The Victorian woman in her green dress did not know she was being poisoned. The question that tonight's story keeps asking quietly is, What don't we know? Arsenic-based green pigments were finally effectively regulated in Britain by the early 20th century, partly through market pressure and partly through legislation. By the time the regulation arrived, safer synthetic dyes had already made the arsenic greens commercially unnecessary. The market had moved on before the law caught up. It usually does, in both directions. If you watched this far, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. See you next time.